Thank you very much. And although I'm London-based, I hope my Lancastrian father and Geordie mother and Dewsbury birthplace and Scarborough upbringing and the string of posts my dad did in local government, which went from, I think, Grimsby to Radcliffe, St Helens, Newcastle, Dewsbury and Scarborough. I feel on the northern front, on the northern Powerhouse front, I'm a legitimate part of this event, so very, very happy to be back up north as always. And yes, with PERDA, all I'll say is I won't talk about future policy. I'll talk about what we've got and what we've had, but I think that's an incredibly important story to share. I think also part of this, and sorry I wasn't here to do the opening this morning, is to internationalize, globalize, give the context of what's going out there in the world, which I think only adds to the positive energy that we're creating in this event and generally in the UK in terms of our place in the world. I'll just run through 2 or 3 slides which just hopefully bring this to life before saying a bit about the global scene. Just to remind ourselves of where the emissions have gone since the Industrial Revolution. For anyone who's wondering whether it sort of really is abnormal what's going on, there's the emissions. So it's an absolutely stunningly unprecedented story in terms of the science. And then in sort of my day job, there's something actually the Met Office did with the Foreign Office a number of years ago, but only is more and more relevant, where you can't read the detail, but essentially what we're looking at is the impacts of 2 degrees and then of 4 degrees on the world. And all the circles are these potential global tipping points that send the world and send the global economy into an unprecedented place. And you can just see the sort of concentration. If you just take that set of circles around Southern Europe and Northeast Africa, we've just had a couple of million refugees come from Syria. And there are about 500 million people living in areas which cannot really withstand any further stress, and there will be further stress. So just to sort of give a geopolitical sense of everywhere in the world, there are these really quite terrifying scenarios if we don't get on top of the emissions side of things. Many of you will have seen this, but just to quickly also give a context for these temperature changes that we talk about. Up there is where we're heading, up to 4 or 5 degrees, but if we implement policies that we've said as governments around the world we will implement, we get up to 2, 3, between 3.1 and 3.7, although we haven't quite formally pledged that much under the Paris Agreement. And then we come all the way down to a 2 degrees world. And remember, over 2 degrees, the IPCC reminded us that all the coral is dead. So just one example of thousands around the world of 2 degrees being an extremely challenging place. And 1.5 is where we've got to get down to. So just to remind ourselves of the scale of the transformation and that we are on the right side of this in stressing clean growth and energy. And the conclusion to this report by the IPCC was the need for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change in all aspects of society. So it's everything and it's everywhere. And I think that's incredibly important to get this out of sort of an environmental box as someone who's got climate change in their title. For me, this is all about economic transformation that works for our societies. There's 2 big things I think the UK has done this year. One is get that secondary legislation through to get net zero by 2050. And it's easy to challenge that. Is that enough? Is it fast enough? 2050 feels a long way away, but we have to explain how that involves action today, because the 5-year carbon budgets that we are under obligation to meet every year out to 2050 are already very pressing and demanding action now. It just means that we've locked in a net zero position, and previously it was 80%. But just a reference back, we were talking with CBI colleagues before about everyone's business, which was this really vital CBI report now about 12 years ago. And the reason I mention it is because the Climate Change Act of the UK in 2008 which we've just upgraded to net zero by 2050. But that original act was about civil society having a fantastic campaign about the need to change, and then business saying, we want that, we want a long-term signal, we want carbon pricing, it's everyone's business. That gave the government space, and it was said to be not really a feasible effort, and it turned out to deliver the biggest majority in Parliament of the 20th century, the 2008 Climate Change Act, which was also the first piece of legislation in the world to comprehensively tackle. So we upgraded that this year on the back, again on the evidence, on the back of the science. So that net zero by 2050 really does put British businesses in a leading position with the sort of policy and regulatory frameworks. They're not all there yet, but energy has been a huge area where we've gone quite a long way, and we've been one of the fastest in the world to do so. The second big thing has been winning the bid for COP26, the Conference of Parties, COP26, next year, the end of next year. So I think it's already been mentioned at the conference, 2020 is an unbelievably important year for the world. There's also the review of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN as the main event of the UN next year. The COP15 on biodiversity, biological convention in China next year, and third, our COP26 at the end of the year, where we've got to have a huge increase in our ambition globally to get ourselves still within chance of keeping temperatures to within reasonable boundaries. So I think those two things, the net zero domestically and hosting COP in Glasgow as our global contribution, we'll do it in partnership with Italy as well. They'll do the pre-COP and a couple of other big events. So there's a nice European collective feel to that next year as well. But those two things squarely put us in the spotlight under a lot of pressure to deliver concrete, policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and concrete business action. But I think also, if you think about the context for this event next year, we've seen what's been happening in the US with President Trump's view. We've seen challenges elsewhere with some of our bigger political leaders around the world who are not engaged on this to the extent they need to be. So the politics has got a lot harder since Paris, and the Paris Agreement 5 years ago was immensely important and historic, but all it did was really get everyone together and agree they needed to do something. This event next year is then about saying what the action is, and that we've really made a step change in reducing emissions in a way that's good for the economy, good for society. So, we think about those challenging politics. The way through that, and I go back to my reference to the original success of the UK Climate Change Act, is that we are seeing on civil society side and amongst citizens and communities this big rising up of engagement and interest again. And then I look to business and it's really the economic opportunities, and the difference between 2015 and 2020 is the economics is profoundly exciting and encouraging in the direction of clean being cheaper, being more job-rich, being higher skilled. And interestingly, one of the early moves by the president in the US, the current president, was to look at those renewable energy subsidies and obligations in the Midwest of the US, full of Republican governors who said to the president, do not touch our efforts to clean our energy systems because they are jobs in every district. And those measures have stayed in place as a result. So the UK only has 1 to 2% of the emissions, only 1 to 2% of the global economy. But to take an issue like out of coal and into offshore wind, we have extraordinary leadership. I could mention so many other areas around our science, around our innovation, around our business entrepreneurship, our universities and innovators. But just to take the energy system, we had 40% coal 7 years ago, and it went to that historic day 2 years ago of zero coal. From 40% of your mix to zero in 5 years, I think would have been deemed absolutely crazy a few years prior. And just recently, the mix the National Grid put out was 54% renewables and 15% gas, small amount of nuclear, no coal. And I really think 2 or 3 years ago, if there had been a quiz amongst really knowledgeable energy folks and asked what's the 54% in the mix and what's the 15%, you probably would have said gas was the big one and and renewables was the smaller number. It's really extraordinary the way that's taking off. So nuclear and gas remain a critical part of our mix, but the way that renewables have taken off, and obviously that then brings us to this extraordinary offshore wind story. And as I go around the world, that coal story and our story now as the biggest installed capacity of offshore wind by some degree is something that's really brought us traction around the world. And the business opportunities, we've just heard of a huge new opportunity in Taiwan, across China, in the US, across Europe. This market is set to increase dramatically. And as an economist by training, I love to look at the productivity numbers and the skills and the jobs. And somebody told me that the first offshore wind turbine went in about 3 months, and that the last one went in 12 hours. So if you want a 100-fold productivity increase in a business, you're not going to get it from the old businesses, you're going to get it from these extraordinary new innovations, thanks to sort of people who are in this room. So I just want to keep it fairly brief to say that this clean track is absolutely where the national government is, and absolutely where we're going to be put under a great spotlight, but also have a great opportunity in the next 18 months. I think it's better to talk about investment rather than cost, but the costs of this are deemed to be manageable, even if you don't factor in all the massive co-benefits to our health, to our societies, to our cities, and so forth. That's the number for the UK low-carbon economy in green, and that's the rest of the economy. So I think we'd all choose the green line. And that was the coal and then the clean stuff coming in to our economy. With two young twins, I'll finish with a literary reference that you might recognise. Here comes Edward Bear coming down the stairs behind Christopher Robin, bump, bump, bump on the back of his head. It is, as far as he knows, the only way of coming down the stairs. He's sure there must be a better way, if only he could stop bumping for a moment and think about it. So, we made extraordinary progress in our economy over many years, but we've been bumping our heads down the stairs, and I think we can all look ahead and come down the stairs in a different way. Thank you very much.